You can learn to actually take pause, and the way that you do that is you have a think back afterwards. What was it that set off that reaction? In the military, they call it left of bang.
Welcome to Compromising Positions. I'm Leanne Potter, cyber anthropologist and head of security operations for a major retailer.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, a cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Together, we're the award-winning tech podcast that asks non-cybersecurity professionals what we in the industry can do to make their lives easier
and help make our organisations more prepared to face ever-changing human-centric cyber threats. In this episode, we're heading back to the vaults to bring you an unabridged version of our fantastic and extremely popular interview with Bec McKeown, a chartered psychologist with an extensive experience in carrying out applied research for organisations including the UK Ministry of Defence and the founder and director of Mind Science, an independent organisation that works with cybersecurity professionals.
Ever wanted to know the psychology behind cybersecurity? Bec takes us on a fascinating journey into the mind as we get acquainted with a smorgasbord of psychological concepts to help you understand your cybersecurity posture, especially during a dreaded cybersecurity incident.
If you haven't listened to this episode, you're in for a treat. But if you have already, we think it's still worth a listen and revisiting, because we could all do better in a cybersecurity incident. Normal programming resumes next week, but for now, see you next time. Keep secure, and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here? I met this guest actually reading a paper that she had contributed to a company called Immersive Labs, and she had a really interesting approach and I was so pleased to see it. She was the director of human science for Immersive Labs, and for those that don't know what Immersive Labs is a really premium cybersecurity training platform, and to me, seeing them meld the highly technical, which it is on their platform, you can practice playing around with malware, you can be on the side of the attacker or the defender, playing around in labs and things like that. To see them bring someone in like our wonderful guest and actually apply behavioural science and psychology to their platform was a really special thing. So Bec, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Bec McKeown. I'm a chartered psychologist and I trained at Cranfield University 20 years ago. I originally intended to go off and do some culture change consultancy as a psychologist, and I got seduced by working in high-risk industries whilst I was a student at Cranfield. So I started my career doing aviation research, so what happens when people panic after an aircraft incident and how do you get people out of an aeroplane quickly. So that sort of started my interest in how people behave in difficult circumstances. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I transferred to the Ministry of Defence contract that Cranfield University had, and that took me off down another different track of how people behave in difficult circumstances. And I did a lot of research into how people learn across the whole of the Ministry of Defence. I learned a lot about why traditional training doesn't work from that particular piece of research. I also worked with the cultural specialists, and what their job is to do is to go to not very pleasant countries and make friends with not very pleasant people, winning hearts and minds. So my job for that was to teach people how to build relationships with people that they don't necessarily have anything in common with. I also, from that, did some research into what is it skills people need to be able to work in an agile way in difficult circumstances. So bringing all of that together kind of took me into cybersecurity. That particular journey started when I worked on the Cyber Masters programme at Cranfield, and I was supervising student dissertations. So obviously I learned a lot about cybersecurity from those. Left Cranfield in 2019 and set up my own business, Mind Science. And I was sort of beetling along, thinking about what products I could build up. And along came Immersive Labs and said, hey, do you want to come and work for us? So I thought, well, why not industry? So I did that for 2 years. And then more recently, I've gone back to being self-employed at Mind Science. I think really the position I'm at now is the industry experience I gained from Immersive Labs, plus all of that research I did over 15 years at Cranfield, has left me with this overwhelming desire to think actually there's so much that psychology has to offer cybersecurity. And that's what I'm up to now, is trying to bring that human science into cybersecurity, but not in a way that is looking at security awareness and not in a way that's looking at what the hackers are doing and motivations. What my interest is in is the people who actually work in cybersecurity, because I don't see so much attention paid to that particular population as I do with everything else.
I mean, every single job you've done, it's like you could be made into a documentary. Like, it's amazing. Wow. I obviously know your more recent work, but your past as well. Amazing. That's some interesting jobs you've had in the past. And what do you feel like
Yeah,
that?
I've been very fortunate.
Yeah. So how do you feel like that past experience has had an impact on what the work you do today with the more human understanding of how cybersecurity teams work?
I think it's been very cumulative. This was never a direction that I would have planned to go into. I never thought that cybersecurity was of interest to me because technically I am hopeless. Anybody who's worked with me will tell you that. So I just didn't really see that I had a purpose within cybersecurity. I found out I did, but as I say, it's all that experience cumulatively. It's been building my knowledge over so many years, and then it's the novice expert differences. A novice playing chess will know certain moves. An expert will look at the board and see the pattern and know where the next sort of 4 or 5 moves is going to come in. And I kind of feel like that about psychology. I've had lots of little chunks of information, but I've been doing it for so long now that they've all come together, and it just enables me to see a far bigger picture, bring it all together.
Do you think that maybe actually, because of cybersecurity, from my experience, and I'm sure Leanne has a similar experience, has actually been most people have moved into it historically from a technical background. And I feel almost like your story is actually coming from a non-technical background, coming from a different science. Technically, it's still a science, it's just not the one you'd expect.
Yeah.
Actually, is an advantage.
I think so. And I found that to be a case across every single type of job that I've worked in. I don't know anything about cybersecurity. I don't know what it's like to have to go through a cybersecurity attack. I don't know what it's like to work in the military. I've been out on exercise with them, which was quite scary enough. I've never had my life threatened in that way. I don't know how to kill people. I've never been a pilot. I've never worked in the airline industry. But what I have found is that people are the same. Our brains work the same. The way the brain works hasn't changed since it evolved. So it's the people thing that is important to me, not necessarily the area in which I apply my trade. And it helps in some respects that I don't know much because it enables me to ask the stupid question. Because I'm not that close to it, I haven't worked in the industry, I'm not so familiar with it that everything around it I can't see anymore. And that's very much a case of how the brain works. It's a limited capacity information processor. It starts to automate certain things. So a lot of the work that you do, you don't even think about it. You have no idea of your capabilities, of your talents as such. You don't know what you see is your day job. So therefore you don't necessarily see, you can't take that step back and unsee what you already know, whereas I can. So I found that's been probably a massive advantage because I see things in a way that other people don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to say, a recurring theme that's been happening as we've been recording this is people pointing out that the curse of knowledge is actually probably one of the most difficult things for cybersecurity teams to overcome. Actually, having that kind of unconventional background really does enable you to have that different perspective. It certainly helps me. I only got into tech into my 30s. I would consider myself non-technical back before I started working in cybersecurity, and I feel it actually is to my benefit that I can remember when all this tech stuff seemed really scary to me, and so it helps me develop a lot of empathy for others when they say I don't understand what you're talking about, or this topic seems really out of reach for me. It enables me to be able to put myself in their shoes, and I think the more that the cybersecurity industry recognizes the benefit of people coming from different backgrounds and what they can bring, not just different experiences, I can really actually imagine, I think we're going to probably come back to that in a question shortly, about understanding high stress situations like you were talking about in your airline research and things like that. Understanding what it's like to be an outsider in this industry is so incredibly important, because otherwise we're never going to change people's perception of us as a industry, but also the perception of the threat that's out there.
It's a really interesting one as well. I think eventually, because cybersecurity is effectively, there's a whole digital lock-picking element, as in, I'm just going to try and crack something. But actually, over time, the number of human threats seems to be going up. The figures seem to be suggesting that. I guess eventually, this is more of a philosophical question. People say, oh, well, I'm not technical. And then I hear them come out with things and go, no, you kind of are now. You kind of are part of the club now, eventually. But not necessarily in the way like you're going to go and configure a firewall.
Yeah, and I think that, to be honest, I think the pandemic changed life for all of us in ways that we could never have expected. And looking back and reflecting on that, I think that we've all had to get more used to technology in a way that we never had to before. I've worked from home for a very long time, so that bit wasn't new. What was new for me was the amount of people that are now willing to have a video call meeting meeting with me instead of making me drive for 2.5 hours for an hour-long meeting. So I think that everybody has embraced that. But I also think the other benefit, I don't know if that's the right word to use because it was a truly awful time, but I think we've all now understood what a volatile, uncertain and complex and ambiguous environment is. And that's something, VUCA environment is something we looked at a lot at Cranfield when I worked there. But now I find it's much easier to talk to people about that because we all lived through that only a couple of years ago. And I think that it's sort of opened people's minds to the technology, but also the complexity of it all, and that things aren't straightforward, and that actually we do have to do work in a very different way because we're not living in the same world that we were living in 10 years ago. And I think it's interesting to see how that's changed very much over the past few years, but also it's interesting because there's still a pull back to the way things used to be. And that I think scares me a little bit because I think that we can't keep harking back to the way we used to do things. It is different. We've got to keep moving forward. I have gone right off on one now. I don't even know where I was going with that.
I think it's really salient because also, as we've changed our effectively way of working, like the threat landscape has changed. People weren't necessarily implementing zero trust architectures because, well, we're all in the office. I guess so. What have your experiences been like engaging with security teams in the past, saying the good and the bad? And what is it like to work in like a really sort of controlling stroke regulated environment?
I think I'll go along with the controlling and regulated environment because that's a bit of a strange one. Working in industry in cybersecurity taught me, it's the first time I'd come across zero trust. And to be honest, I found it the most frustrating thing ever. Absolutely hated it because anytime I had to do something even very basic, I've got to put a Zendesk ticket in for something. I've worked with the Ministry of Defence. I had more freedom working there. I had more freedom working for a pharmaceutical company, which is also highly regulated, years ago.
How odd is that? I've had more freedom working in the NHS than I've had in private industries.
Yeah, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there's an argument that actually probably they're lagging behind.
Well, I would, in the case of the NHS, I felt like it was more enabling. There were still controls in place, don't get me wrong, but it was definitely more enabling.
Yeah, and I think that sort of kind of leads us nicely into talking about trust, really, doesn't it? Because I felt that actually what is the zero trust thing is quite insulting. Maybe that's me, ego, get over yourself type thing. But actually, I'm a professional. I'm in my 50s. I'm not stupid. Why are you treating me like that? Because actually that's not helping me to engage with you. You've left me with no choice but to do this process of reporting, but actually it doesn't make me feel that great. And in fact, it makes me think of something that Christian talked about in his podcast, which was if people hate something, they disrespect the rest of your rules. And it kind of sets off a culture, I guess, of that mistrust. And that to me is kind of wrong, really. There's some psychological theory about workplace psychology. It's called Theory X and Theory Y. So Theory X is that all of your employees are stupid. They can't be trusted with anything. And if you turn your back, they'll be skiving off. They won't work at all. Theory Y is actually we're grown-ups. We can be trusted, mostly. We have agency and we work much better in that way. So the more freedom you give us, the more likely we are to comply. And as Christian pointed out, that's massively counterintuitive. But I think that the zero trust thing for me is kind of almost going back to the dark ages in terms of work psychology, because you just don't have to do that anymore. So I think that you're probably right, and there could be some sort of balance between the zero trust thing and actually letting people, enabling them to do their job. And that, I think, is very much about this one size fits all approach to, right, stop everybody doing everything because we don't trust any of you. I don't feel that it's that great.
Okay, from a technical standpoint, I obviously get it. But from a empowering and autonomy perspective, it just causes a lot of bad will between my customers, and I call anyone that's wanting to engage with a process that's, to be quite frank, hindered by cybersecurity, as a customer. I worry about like the sort of long-term impacts. And I think, yes, you're right when Christian said in an earlier episode about how they might not break that rule, but they'll break something else and it'll just have a little ripple effect, and it is just bad will. But I even hate the word zero trust and the language we use in cybersecurity is just so antagonistic. You know, we call people the weakest link. You know, we say things like, you know, people are stupid if they click on things. That kind of language does not endear us to other people at all.
Yeah, I said we all know about carrot and stick. What works, the carrot or the stick? You beat people enough and they'll comply, sort of, but behind your back. You know, there's a saying, I don't know where it comes from, that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar.
Yeah.
You know, the nicer you are to people, the more likely they are to respond to you. And in fact, that's one of the key tenets of influence. Robert Cialdini wrote some books on influence, and we like people like ourselves. And if people are nice to us, we feel more inclined to do nice things back. It's that reciprocity, I think, is the word
I did a whole talk on reciprocity, and I literally had to toe tap my way through the whole presentation to try and get the words out.
Yeah. But it's that thing, you know, trust people, be nice to them, they'll be nice and trust you back. What's so difficult to understand?
Yeah.
It's a basic human thing.
Yeah, and it's that balance. So I can see from the other side of something like zero trust, which I agree is like badly worded. I think they wouldn't sell Coca-Cola if they just said this drink will kill you. If that was the brand, you know, the brand name for it. It's not very well branded. But from an external attacker point of view, I can totally see it. But it shouldn't be, in my opinion, implemented to the point where it hinders you, like really actively hinders you from doing your job. And I think there's ways of doing it that don't involve you hindering people, legitimate users, from doing their jobs. I've seen it implemented both sides of the coin. But yeah, I think from an internal point of view, the lack of trust it's not doing the image of cybersecurity any good.
And I think also it's something I was talking about at a conference a couple of weeks ago was a thing called just culture. It's something that's very prevalent in the aviation industry, and regulators actually say you need to develop a just culture. And what that means is that it's a culture of understanding that mistakes can be made, and it's a culture where it enables people to say, actually, do you know what? I put my hand up, I've done something really stupid, and this is a result of it. And instead of giving them a warning, telling them they're stupid, you go, right, okay, that's fine. Can we sit down and let's work out how that actually came to happen? And if you run through things like that on a timeline, you start to unpick that there's a lot more to it than just that event that one particular person was involved in. And it's, if you've got the culture that enables that, what you do, instead of people hiding their mistakes and hiding the problems that are in your system, they'll come and tell you about them and you can fix them. So I think there's another way of going about things, but the zero trust and the people are stupid is not happening. It's not encouraging that.
It feels like enabling a learning from failure culture might be more appropriate. Going with like acknowledging everybody's trying to do a good job and trying to do the right thing, and sometimes things happen, and how do you prevent them from happening again? And if you bury it, then it will happen again.
Yeah, I think so. There is always going to be the odd person that is there for malicious intent. They're going to do bad things. You're never going to stop that. That's human nature. But the vast majority of people won't be doing that on purpose. It will be some sort of a mistake or some part of the process that doesn't quite work properly. And it might well be just because they're having a bad day, or it's Friday afternoon, they're going on holiday on Saturday and they just want to go home.
When I reached out to have you as a guest on a podcast, we had a little sort of pre-chat. And one thing that really stuck with me, something you said, it was, why am I, the non-security person, such a threat? And we sort of delved into that, and hopefully we can recreate some of that magic again. But you were talking about how the sort of failures of mandatory training, and one amazing example you gave was being, you know, how many times have we all been taught in an organization manual handling, even though that's not part of your job? And I thought that insight was really summed up. When training is done right, it's great, and you know, raising awareness is great. But when it's unnecessary and a burden to your job, the impact on that can be quite detrimental to the kind of good faith you're trying to build up. So yeah. Why am I, the non-security person, such a threat? So why do you think the way we approach training people about cybersecurity makes people feel that way?
Well, anybody who puts the word mandatory in front of training is just asking to have everybody switched off anyway. I think, I don't feel too embarrassed to admit to this, but mandatory training, the email comes around, you haven't done it, your line manager's going to chat to you if you don't do it, so you get a free half an hour, you open it up. And I used to bang through that thing as quickly as I possibly could do and see how quick I'd get through it and still score 100%, because it's mostly common sense. And I've done it every year or every other year for the past 20 odd years. Did I care about it? No. Did I know which fire extinguisher was suitable for which fire by the colour on the label on the bottle as I walked down the corridor 3 seconds after finishing that training? Absolutely not. Not engaged whatsoever. And I know I'm not the only one who's had that experience.
If we're being a confessional, I'm sure me and Jeff could probably say we've all played that game where we've tried to see how fast we can get through it.
Someone who isn't me definitely went through some mandatory training in the past and screen grabbed the material as it was going so I could answer the questions at the end. Someone who
That's
isn't
a
me, I
lot.
will stress.
Yeah. I mean, that's the person who wasn't you. Was actually, I think, putting a lot more effort in than I ever did. But yeah, I mean, I actually did some research evaluating some of the military mandatory training, and we had two parts of it to evaluate. One was very sort of, it was interesting because it was equality and diversity. So that sent me off down another track of how I found out why equality and diversity training doesn't work. And the other one was the law of armed conflict, which is a law, therefore it is a set of rules. So you've got two things going on here. You've got one that's very emotion based, it's about feelings, it's about the way you've been brought up and your values, and you've got another one which is a set of rules that you can learn. So that's why we chose those two particular ones. And what we found is that anything to do with rules that you can learn and knowledge is very easy to do mandatory training for, as long as you keep repeating it at the right levels, otherwise you get skill fade. But what we found out is that applying that sort of mandatory training and the way it's done to anything that's got what we call an affective part to it, so it has an emotional component to it, you absolutely can't train it that way, because otherwise people just tick the most legal sounding answer to get through the training. Have they actually thought about it and learned from it? And the answer to that generally is no. What we found was, or what people wanted, was to do the equality and diversity, the knowledge part. You can read that anywhere. What they got the most out of in actual training, the classroom contact hours, was those discussions. So you have a group of people together, they talk about their experiences, everybody sees it from a different viewpoint, and hearing somebody else talk about that from their own viewpoint was the thing that helped change people's mindsets and actually had an impact. So when I hear that equality and diversity training doesn't work, it doesn't work because you're not doing it right. And I think that also applies in security awareness. That blanket thing, never going to work. Make it appropriate for whichever job role that you're training it to.
Yeah, I guess one of the interesting things is quite often practitioners end up designing and delivering the training. And I guess the question is, and I think it's kind of a slightly rhetorical question based on this line of discussion, is am I, say, the security person or the whatever other practitioner, am I the best person to design or deliver this training? And who do you think would be a better place to actually do that?
Well, it's an interesting question, because what we're looking at there is an either or. And when, again, doing some more military stuff, I have done an awful lot with military training research. What I saw being implemented in some places was where you had expert content writers working alongside expert learning designers. So what you've got, and I think this will be ace within cybersecurity, you've got the person who has the technical knowledge, because you do need to know these things, but they work alongside somebody who understands how educational design works, how to develop learning objectives and outcomes, how to measure that sort of thing, and also how to make sure that the training's delivered so they get feedback so they can actually learn properly. So I think that actually it's not one or the other. I think it's a mixture of both. And the other thing is, and the military certainly do this a lot, is that you can train technical experts in how to deliver training, but just expecting them to do it based on training they've had themselves, or the fact they can just stand up and talk about it. There's a whole process and a lot of research, and it's a whole academic discipline in itself, is how to deliver training. But there's no reason why technical people couldn't learn that.
Very much so. And I think there is an assumption, wrongly in my opinion, that, because throughout our education system, we see teachers all the time. They're very commonplace in our lives. So therefore, actually, we forget that that's an actual real skill, that these people, these teachers, they didn't just go to school and learn their subject, they learned how to teach. And I think the expectation of cybersecurity practitioners to knock up some security awareness training, or what's becoming a lot more prevalent now, is before companies make the plunge and actually hire a security training person in, is having that someone dedicate a little bit of their time to that role, but just letting anyone do it just because they work in cybersecurity without that understanding of everyone has different learning styles, people taking information different ways. How are you going to teach people who have a lot more a kinetic learning style in a remote setting? I wouldn't even know myself how to kind of tackle that. What are your sort of thoughts on how do we account for all the different ways people want to learn, all the sort of different ways of thinking? Also, even cultural background will play a part in how you ingest that learning.
Interestingly, the learning styles thing is very much more of a popular psychology thing. There's no actual science behind to say that you will belong to one category or the other. You will have preferences. They are preferences, and you may have several different styles. The thing that is useful about learning styles is to explain, it's got a great explanatory power because we all do learn differently. So don't try and second guess how people are learning. It's more about providing a range of different learning. And also, I think this goes into sort of micro learning, which more and more people are becoming aware of now. Nobody wants to sit there for 3 hours looking at some PowerPoint slides.
No.
So what you can do is you have a virtual learning environment. You put documents that can be read. You can put podcasts on there for people to listen to. There's games that people can play. You can do research challenges, so they have to go out and find out things themselves and come back and share them with other people. There are so many different teaching techniques that you can use, and they can be done online, offline, in real life, or self-paced learning. That is the thing that's important. And I think it's about being creative and being in touch with your audience. I mean, obviously, I'm of a certain age and I learned from books and making notes, and I still revert back to that because it's how I get things to go in. Podcasts are something I listen to when I go to sleep generally. So, they send me to sleep, so I'm not really going to learn much there.
Except this one, obviously.
No, I listened to these. I listened to this while I was painting the bathroom, actually, because I knew then it was something to take away the boredom of that, and I'll keep my brain going.
You hinted at that as you're talking there. One of the points that I find really interesting is gamification, and in general, but also then gamification in learning. Maybe just sort of delve a little bit into that and your experiences of that.
Yeah, I think it's great if it's done well. I came across one that was just done absolutely appallingly, and it was aimed at what I would consider probably to be 5 or 6 year olds and being delivered to adults. It's really got to be audience appropriate. We all know that people like leaderboards and winning medals and all of that sort of thing, but not everybody does. If you're into that sort of thing, then yes, fine. But people my sort of age, you offer me a leaderboard, I don't care. I have no interest whatsoever. So again, it's about that range of things. Gamification is another thing that it makes it a bit more interesting than sitting reading some dry text, as long as it's done right.
Yeah, and I think it can go really wrong. I've started reading a book recently all about gamification. I can't remember the chap's name, but he's really good, and I'll put it in the show notes. And it's been a good read so far, and he says there's a danger that people see gamification in terms of how your mobile apps are nowadays, like mobile gaming, in terms of like it's just about the dopamine hit, like just you're not actually learning anything, you're just trying to get to the next stage. And actually that's when that's applied to things like learning and development. People are like, oh, let's just add some gamification to this, and that'll make it more interesting. But done badly, achieves nothing.
Yeah, and back in the day when we were doing research into this, it was serious games, it was called. And it was called that because actually it was the gaming side of it, but there was also the learning side of it. So, for example, you can be playing a game, but if you get something wrong and don't get feedback as to what was wrong, then you're not actually learning anything. You just get stuck, or you're just enjoying the gamification side. So that's why you need to work with people who are good at learning design, because they'll know when to put feedback in. They'll know to have objectives. Therefore, you know that when you come out of it, you will have learned something. It's not playing a game just for the sake of it. So it's about having that understanding of learning design to go along with the gamification.
There's something you also mentioned very early on that really pricked my ears up, talking about studying how people panic. And one thing about cybersecurity, especially when you get maybe a dubious email and say, oh, please, you need to send me your details now because I need you to pay an invoice today, this hour. Fear and panic actually kind of is part of cybersecurity. I think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, in two respects, because in one, what they're doing there is generating that amygdala hijack. The amygdala is this tiny little thing in the middle of the brain, and that sets off your adrenaline to flow, basically. It's a whole process that goes on with that, obviously not quite that simple, but that sets it. Once the adrenaline starts to flow, heart rates increase, and then you have this thing called cognitive narrowing. So you stop thinking about everything else. Your brain just focuses down on the threat in front of you. So then you're getting that, oh gosh, I need to do something about this. You've got another cognitive bias, which means that, it's better to take some action than no action. So you are driven to press the yes, pay this thing because my boss just told me to and it was urgent. And then all of a sudden you've given the entire organisation's finances to somebody else. But that's what they're doing, is the way that they word it is to create an urgent need to react. So there's that sort of panic or it induces reaction type thing, and that's the social engineering side of it. And then you've also got the same thing that could happen if you're in a team that's dealing with a cyber attack, and it's that dawning realization that somebody's in your system, and it might have taken a while for that to sink in. You go and do your checks and balances to make sure it's not something that's just gone wrong, and then as that realization dawns that you are now under threat, that same process kicks in, and that also affects then the way that you would deal with whatever's coming in. So you're not necessarily looking at all of the information, you're just looking at a very narrow focus on it and just being pushed to respond to that particular threat. So again, this is kind of why I find the whole human thing so fascinating, because you've got the same process happening in the brain, but it's working from two different sides.
I guess what's the antidote to that, in your opinion?
Oh, there's plenty of people who can tell you lots of things to do about that. First of all, realise that there isn't just an antidote that you can just do a thing and it'll stop, because that's not going to happen. It's a natural, instinctive reaction. You can learn to actually take pause, and the way that you do that is you have a think back afterwards. You think, well, what was it that set off that reaction? In the military, they call it left of bang. So what happened before it all kicked off? Because then that was what you call a contextual cue. It's your cue from the environment that's about to happen. So you might think, okay, I feel a bit panicked, or I can't concentrate properly, or everybody's running around like headless chickens, or hang on, there's a cue. That cue means that we're all going into this mode. So what we need to do is to just stop and fight that reaction to panic. And controlled breathing is a very well-known thing of how to calm yourself down, and to take a step back and to start putting things in place logically. Now, aviation people, pilots have checklists, because actually going to that checklist and picking up that and working your way through that is enough to stop you reacting and going, oh my God, I'm getting lost with a plane, and, driving off in some completely wrong direction. And I think that that's where your cybersecurity playbook can be very handy, because it stops you doing the panic thing. You've got a set amount of steps that you have to do. That in itself can then stop that panic reaction.
When you were talking just then, I immediately thought Bec would be a really good person to have during tabletop simulations and things like that. And probably actually a really good person to have during an actual incident going ahead. Can you walk me through what, from your experience as a psychologist, working in this space, understanding high stress environments, but within the context of like a sort of cybersecurity incident, what's gold standard look like, I guess, for a cybersecurity team?
Yeah, there is, as we've just been talking about with training, it's going to be a gold standard. It's going to be different for everybody, because everybody's context is different and every situation is different. You can't train for every situation, but my research has taught me to believe you can train for any situation. So it's about having the skills to be able to question what's in front of you. Cognitive agility is something that I've done a lot of research into, and it's the ability to take that pause that we were just talking about there, and to start critically evaluating what's in front of you. So what is the source of your information? Have we got information from more than one source? Somebody else from a different group will have a different view on that information. So in military, we call it red teaming. I think the same, possibly we use the same phrase in cybersecurity. Yep. Decision testing. There's a whole ton of stuff that you can put in place. And I think that it's having that ability to flex. So when do I pick up the playbook and follow that? And when do I know that actually this situation is not going to be helped by the playbook? I have to then become creative. Then you've got a whole other set of thinking skills there. It's about convergent and divergent thinking. And to be fair, I could go on about this for hours, so I probably won't go down that route.
If you could explain convergent, divergent thinking for
listeners. Okay. Well, convergent thinking is when you what you tend to do is you focus down. You're focusing down. So here's the problem. We're thinking about the solution, and we're narrowing down about all of the benefits and the disadvantages until we come to a thing, and then we act on it. So that's convergent, because we're converging down on one particular decision. Now, a divergent thinker will do it exactly the opposite way. So instead of coming up with one thing, narrowing down to one thing, they'll come up with lots of different options. We could do this, we could do that, we could do A, B, C, D, E, F, Z, H, J, K. Right, now then, once we've done that, that's the creativity, then you can converge down from that. But instead of just going down on one option, you're there creating lots of different options, and you might even bring parts from each of those different options to create something new. So the ability to move from convergent to divergent thinking and to know when to do that is basically what agile thinking is all about. And that, for me, is how you train for every situation without training for any particular situation. if that makes any sense whatsoever.
No, it totally does.
Yeah, and because so you've got the cognitive, the thinking side of things, but you've also got the people side of things. Because the other thing that we tend to do is we like people who think like us. We've all been in a meeting where somebody says something and you look around the room and everybody's rolling their eyes because this person is the one person that always chucks a spanner in the works. Do you know what? Listen to that person. And Christian said this the other day, listen to the people who are complaining because they've got something to tell you. They're going to tell you where the problems are in your system. But also having those challenges to that groupthink means that you get that divergence of thought again. It is so easy for me to say it. It is so difficult to do, particularly if you're working in a team that's very bonded. Everybody knows each other really well. We all think very similarly. And so actually building a diverse team is something you'll hear a lot of people say it's not easy to do. But if you can, then that's where the beauty of this cognitive agility comes in. So it's about the thinking side of things. It's about building relationships, but to do both of those things, it's about self-awareness. The three components to it. But for me, that's, you can tell I'm just so excited about this. It's something that I did a lot of research into when I was looking at how people who are successful in cross-cultural environments, how do they think, what skills do they have, and how do they develop them? Because that's the answer to being able to work across many situations and not just keep relying on experience of one particular way of working and apply that blindfold to everything.
To me, what I find interesting about that research you've just mentioned there is it kind of flies in the face of we work in heuristics because it's easy. You know, we draw upon past experiences, we do things based on rote, based on ritual, because otherwise the cognitive load would be too much. But I can definitely see how, and normally we laud that as a good thing, but I can definitely see how in certain circumstances, yes. So for example, during a tabletop exercise or heavens forbid, an actual incident, and you get out that dusty playbook and you start running through it, you know, knowing we've trained, we've done this before, we've got a bit of muscle memory, that's a positive thing. But like you say, having that mental agility to be able to say, this is off script, and we can move towards that. And it kind of makes me think of, you know, when you do speak to like customer services, for example, and they're brilliant when they've got something on script, but then when they don't have the autonomy when something comes off script to kind of help you, and you get frustrated with that. And that learning that you've mentioned there is going to be so key. So how would people encourage in cybersecurity teams to embrace that learning? It's not an easy thing to me, by the sounds of it, to start flexing that muscle a little differently.
It is, yeah, but I think it's not something that you're ever going to learn from going on a training course. And this is kind of really why I went to work with Immersive Labs, because they get micro learning and little nibbles and taking it back to the workplace. And that's how adults learn. So for me, it's about learning about these things. You can have knowledge about it. I could teach you lots of different techniques that you can use, and that's going to be great. But it's only when you get back into the workplace and you start to use them, and it might not necessarily be an emergency situation. It might just be in an ordinary decision-making situation. But you start to use them. Then we go through and actually we look back on it and review, right, so what happened here? How did it go? Did it go well for you? What did you learn from that? What did you differently that made it go well as a result of the thing that you learned? What didn't work quite so well? What do you think happened there? Why do you think that happened? What would you do next time? And that is the most painful bit, to be honest. I used to hate having to do reflective learning, but if you stick with it, you do it automatically. So you start to learn all the time, and then each time you learn something new, you go back and it builds up your worldview, because you're learning by mistakes, you're learning by doing. And then each time you go around that learning loop, you're moving up from novice to competent, expert, mastery, you know, so you become better and better and better at learning that subject the more that you do it. There is a phrase, slow learning, quick results, or something like that. I will have to look it up. But you're learning very slowly, but actually your learning is being put into action the minute you learn it. It's not like going on a training course. You start to use it 2 months after you went on the course, by which time you've forgotten some of it anyway. So it's about the way you learn, not just what you actually learn.
Feels like the SQS, so I've been involved recently with design for an H&D program in Scotland. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things they're pushing now, and it's really hard to quantify, is meta skills. And it sounds like what you're talking about there is meta skills. It's not just learn how to deal with this one thing. It's like learning actual life skills that make you a more rounded person.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, and metacognitive skills is something else that's knowing what you know, and I wonder if that's what they're getting at there as well. And it is. I read an interesting piece of research that said that when you're coming out of university, you're equipped with the technical skills you need, but you're not equipped to deal with the workplace. You don't know how the workplace works. You don't understand culture, about how to behave in the workplace, about the nature of relationships in the workplace. So I think it's becoming more common for people to recognise that soft skills, even though I hate calling it that, it's a phrase that most people recognise, soft skills are so important. But I think that's kind of even been knocked out during schools now. It's all about STEM, English, SAT scores, exam results, and I don't think you can even take psychology until you're in a sixth form. So to me, the whole education system is not geared around the way that people work. But that's a rant for another time.
No, I also agree, and I bet not open that can of worms either.
I imagine, because some of those ones are so, I'd imagine from a point of view that they're quite quantifiable. Like you can pass a math test paper. Yeah. If they get 1 + 1 wrong, you can be quite definitive in saying it's wrong. I imagine with some of these, again, I don't like the term soft skills either, because it kind of
I actually learned I learned a new word for it. Impact skills is a word, and I liked it a lot. Skills that have impact on beyond the task itself.
Yeah.
I loved it.
No, that's really interesting that you say that, because I was thinking about how we measure these skills, and there's a thing called Kirkpatrick's framework for measuring training evaluation. But I think that's been around for, I don't know, donkey's years. And I was talking to somebody at Cranfield where I used to work, and they are now looking at measuring impact rather than measuring learning from training, which I thought was massively interesting. And they've developed a framework for doing that. Unfortunately for me, it's proprietary, so I can't use it. But basically what they asked themselves is that as an educational establishment, do they deliver the impact that warrants the investments that clients make in learning and development? And I just thought that's a really interesting question. And does industry even understand how value is delivered through the work that we do? And I've just read that out from this particular booklet of theirs. I'll just run through a couple of things. You might find it quite interesting.
Yeah, please do.
They have categories of impact driver. So the first one is sort of about conversations and communications. So what is it that you learned in the educational program that means that you can go back to the workplace and have conversations develop as a consequence of what's been learned? So the way that they communicate outside of the program changes. So therefore, you're making a bigger impact in your workplace because you've learned how to communicate differently. Sense making. People learn something new. They go back and they can then solve organisational level challenges because they've learned to look at things from a different perspective, and they can make sense of it in a way they never did before. Relationships, we've already talked about this. It's about building different relationships in the workplace that can have a massive impact on performance, alignment, changing priorities, following, having been on a training course, and actually being able to align what you do to the organisation's overall goals. So that is going to make a big impact in the way that you engage with your role and the work that you do. Engagement, that's another one. And capability. I think their participants linked their changing capability to performance benefits within the organisation. So everything is starting to look at the impact that training has, not I've learned something through knowledge and I can apply it and I can say it by rote, because you can, and a lot of things like that. But having that doesn't necessarily mean you transfer it. So I was really keen to see what they've been doing on this measuring impact, because I think that that's the way that evaluation is going to go, because it takes away the problem of I can measure a task that you've taught me, but I can't measure decision making because you don't know what went on in my head. You don't know the process that I got to get to that decision. And even when you've made the decision, you can't necessarily know that it was a good or a bad decision until many months down the line. So therefore, it makes it really difficult to measure. But I think if you start to look at impact in the business, it's going to be an interesting area of research going forward. And I'm keeping an eye on that to see where it's going to go, because I think it could be the answer to the problems we have with measuring workplace learning.
I think that's, people always say, oh, well, one of the challenges you have as a cybersecurity professional is keeping up. Yeah, keeping up is very difficult, but actually can't even measure that, really. And I think the whole question around measurement in cybersecurity is a minefield, and I've seen very few instances where we've managed to crack it. So throughout my cybersecurity career, I've just had reports under my nose. Okay, we've our controls have stopped these many attacks, these many let in, for example, and 500 people have done the security awareness training in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But then, so what?
Yeah.
The so what piece.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's really,
Yeah.
really difficult. And it's the so what piece of so what for the teams themselves, the cybersecurity practitioners, like, what do you want, a pat on the back? Is that good? Is that bad?
Yeah.
And then the so what from the business going, yeah. So
I'd say, but some of that, unfortunately, I think is driven by a certain behaviour of, well, we from a compliance point of view, we need to have done this training annually, and that everybody new needs to have done it. And people go, rather than, this could be in anything, this could be in anti-money laundering, it could be in any kind of, back to the term mandatory training, any kind of training. Is it just there to be a checkbox or not?
Pretty much. If what you're doing is putting bums on seats, and were you there or weren't you? Did you complete it? Did you pass yes? Is there any way that you can then guarantee that transfer of training? Because there is no direct connection between awareness and behaviour change. There is a model, behavioural intention. So basically what it says is you can make somebody aware of it, but in order for them to change it, there's a whole load of moderating variables in between that, and that's going to be based on the context, their values they've been brought up with, what their friends think. It might well be what their peers think. You behave differently at work as you do at home. There'll be certain things that we do and comply with at work because we have to, because work gives us money to pay for our homes, but we wouldn't dream of doing something like that outside. So it's just recognising that awareness is never going to equal a change in behaviour, because there's too many things happen in the way. Therefore, if awareness is done at several different levels in several different ways, you've got a better chance of it sinking in. So awareness training, for example, is one thing. Then you've got the posters around the office, which is slightly old-fashioned now. If you look at it from many different ways of doing it, you're more likely to get more compliance, because there's the people who absolutely will not do it because they hate it. There's the people that love it and do it and really truly believe in it, and there's everything in between. So you've got to try and pick up on all of those different attitudes towards it, which again makes it more complicated, because then we go down the road of one size doesn't fit all. Again, it's circular, isn't it? We just keep ending back in the same place.
It just reminds me of those adverts, which I'm sure you remember, because they've become a bit of a meme. Copyright, and when it comes to things like software, and I think it was actually about movies, like you wouldn't steal a car, you wouldn't steal an X, and sure, it made people aware, but did it really change any behaviour, other than the fact that people like to laugh about it as kind of a meme later on?
It might make you remember it. You might not do anything about it, but that's the only thing that you can hope, is it made you laugh, so it sticks in your mind. But that's better than me doing my fire extinguisher training at Cranfield, where it didn't even make it through to switching down the computer at the end of after the session. So,
but
again,
what would have made it a more effective campaign? That one in particular, it's about it's about pirating films, isn't it? Online, that advert would be actually maybe the key grip who works on that film. They couldn't hire one. He lost out, wasn't able to make any money. That kind of emotive story instead would have been effective. Like every time you do this, you are impacting the industry. We have to cut corners somewhere. We're cutting corners at the human element. I was going to ask, you said to me in one of our pre-discussions, don't measure things just because you can. And you mentioned that in terms of you need to identify value and business impact. What do you mean by don't measure things just because you can?
You can't. Well, I think we've kind of already sort of skirted around it. Is that you can comply with regulation by saying you've trained everybody, but have you trained everybody, or did you just have them there and they've completed the training? It's measuring the easy things. So it's easy to measure knowledge because you either know things or you don't. Like I talked about the law of armed conflict, and certainly there'll be a whole bunch of stuff that is knowledge based, and you can measure it. You can't necessarily measure somebody's attitude towards something. I mean, you can have attitude surveys, but that's going to depend on them filling it in. You can measure what's directly observable and that we can understand, and it's easy. But is it actually going to measure the impact that it has on the business? The model I mentioned earlier, the Kirkpatrick model, which is the one I was taught when I did my training, has 4 different levels. So level 1 is reaction, the happy sheet. Did people find it engaging? Was it relevant to them? Did they enjoy the lunch? Was the room the right temperature? Those sort of standard forms that you fill in at the end. We used to fill in at the end of a training course. Then the other thing that you've been measured is the learning. So that's that test. You take a test before you take it afterwards, you see an improvement in scores. We love that because then we can directly show that training made me know more, therefore it was worth the spend. But you might have learned something, but did that change behaviour? So that's the degree to which the people who are on that training course actually apply what they learned when they get back to on the job. So again, if it's observable, if we can see, do you shut the fire door every time you go through it because it's a fire hazard? Yes, I do, because because the door's open or shut. Have I changed my mind about equality and diversity? You're never going to know, because what are you going to do? Measure my behaviour? How do you do that with everybody? How do you actually prove that happened? Exactly the same applies to cybersecurity awareness training. You've trained all this stuff. How do I get back? Oh, let's do a phishing thing. But there could be a million and one reasons why that didn't particularly work. So you're never really sure that training had that effect. And then you've got level 4 of the model, which is what outcomes occurred as a result of the training. So have you actually had less cyber incidents as a result of all of this training? Or do we know that? Is that measurement ever brought into the equation? Or does it stop with, we train the people, they're still doing the bad thing?
I would love to think that there's cyber criminals all over the world going, oh no, have you heard about Company X's security awareness training? We better not go there. They're really well trained, and avoid them.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if that happened, because I'd quite like it if it did. We all know that, I don't know, it's easy to focus on things that are obvious and are there in front of you. It's not so easy to dig around into the problem, and I think that's another natural thing that we do as part of this, the way that the brain works, those heuristics, is that actually we try and find a solution. What we don't do is stay in the problem space and dig around in that to actually find out what's causing it. We just go and apply a solution that we think is sensible, which goes back to that user-centered design thing. We don't know what other people do for their jobs. We think they do, but we don't know what it's like until you've actually had the experience of working in that role. I say being at the coalface, but that's quite an old-fashioned way of talking now, isn't it?
I say nowadays being at the code face.
The code face. Oh, I like that. Oh, yes, thank you. I should write that down.
And I do wonder, though, if the way cybersecurity arranges its metrics is because of the context of the business overall. So unless you actually work in a cybersecurity company, you are just a small element of this business.
Mm-hmm.
You're not part of usually a revenue generating team. You're not usually. I would argue there is definitely occasions where cybersecurity teams are definitely valuable and part of that value offering. And Jeff and I have done talks on that very thing. However, traditionally, not seeing as either value adding, if we think of it in the terms of tech, about software development, building things to create value for their customers that will be revenue generating. We don't really do that, but we're still tested on very similar metrics of value driven. Like, did you finish that project? Well, no cybersecurity project ever finishes. That's probably why there's so much burnout in this industry. And the other thing is you can't test what you don't know what happened, because obviously the outcomes are, again, led by humans. They're led by cyber criminals usually. And how on earth are you going to predict if your interventions prevented anything? They might have just gone for a different target. It's very much a numbers game.
Yeah.
Were you unlucky enough to be in someone's sights that day? And how do you even test against that?
Well, and you can't, and that's it, because we can't prove it. Any psychologist will tell you they hate the word prove, because we don't ever prove anything where human behaviour is concerned. You can have results, data that supports your theory, or it doesn't support it, but you never prove anything. And I think that if you think about the way that we all were at school, you pass things, you get certificates and things, you go to university, you do the same, you do your cybersecurity certifications, you're doing the same thing again. The way that the whole education system is set up throughout our whole lives is about proof that you can do something. And that is all about knowledge, observable knowledge. The philosophical underpinning is behaviourism. And it came around in the 50s. All of our education system is built on it. Everything in the military education system is purely built on it. We measure things that we can observe. And yet we know through later philosophies about constructivism, the way that I've been talking about adults learn, we build knowledge in our brains, we go and try it out, we learn by mistakes. That's never moved into the education system. So everything that we do is based on a system that's been around for 50 plus years, 70 years. I'm forgetting how far into the 2000s we are now. So we know it's an automatic thing. If you can measure it, you can prove it works. If you can't measure it, you can't prove it works, therefore it's not worth anything. So it's about challenging those years and years old assumptions about how we go about measuring things that needs to change. I've been talking about it for 20 years. I haven't seen any much of a shift in in change of direction yet. But yeah,
no, but I'm sure your research is contributing to that needle moving forward, even if it is incrementally. And I don't think it's you. I think it's not just change little c, is it? It's changing mindsets. It's changing the way business is run. It's changing the way one team gets budget and another team doesn't. It's a huge.
It's a culture change. Yeah, moves at the speed of a glacier. Yeah.
It does feel like some of it is like effectively they're trying to use a quantitative kind of measurement for something that's qualitative at best.
Yes, exactly that. And it's a natural go-to position. It's very few people actually challenge that. And I certainly didn't challenge it until I went and did my master's degree and learned that there's other ways of looking at the world. So, it is what it is. But quantitative is always valued over qualitative.
Yeah, and I think that's such a shame because there's a potential to learn so much more in the grey areas, which is the human psyche is just full of grey areas and things.
Yeah.
Final question for you. So your business is all about focusing uniquely on the cybersecurity teams themselves, all for that a nice bit of introspection. What does that look like? So, well, firstly, when people come and hire your services, what are they after, and how do you get them to where they need to be?
I think what they're after is the difficult one, because people don't necessarily know what they need. They know they have a problem, but how to solve it is a different thing. And I think what they actually want is to have confidence that their teams can step up when the time happens, because it will happen. That's kind of well known now, I think. And also to know that not only can they step up in terms of the way that they react to it, but they step up together as a team. Because one thing that does happen a lot when people are under pressure is there's conflict, always. There's always frictions. That itself can get in the way and hinder any sort of response, because if you've got people arguing amongst themselves because they've got different views on what needs to happen and when and why, then that's wasting time. That's not an effective response. So what they're looking for is to have confidence that their team can step up, can do it together as a team. They'll act resilient, they'll have resilience as a team then, and you'll have a far more effective response and a quicker response, and you'll also be able to recover more quickly afterwards. So it's about solving a problem rather than looking for a particular outcome, if that makes sense.
Amazing. So obviously the suggestion is hire your services, but for our listeners, what could they do tomorrow to start thinking about making those relationships better?
Right. Okay. It's about people spending time with each other and listening to each other. So for me, if I were to a crisis response team generally is going to have different people from different departments. Tabletop exercise is actually a great way to start the conversations, as long as you're not just going through the process of doing the exercise. Because what I found at Immersive Labs when we were watching these things with the crisis sim is that you start to have arguments in the room. Somebody wants to do it one way, somebody else wants to do it a different way. And it's very easy to get caught up in arguing and trying to push for your way forward. What you need to do is just stop at that point and think, right, okay, so why do you want to do it that way? What's your story? What makes that so important to you? And if each person can talk about that, they'll start to understand each other. You might not agree, but at least then you'll understand, well, actually, they've got a viewpoint that the business needs to carry on running, for example, whereas IT might want to just shut it down because they know that's the safest way to stop this thing. Let those conversations happen in a safe space when you've got time and you're not under pressure, because then that's all out the way. When the chips are down, you can just get on with your job, and you kind of know when you've got to give and compromise because somebody else's priorities make more sense in that particular context. So yeah, talk to each other, listen to the detractors, listen to the people that don't think the same as you, and just try and understand where they're coming from. Ask the why question.
Absolutely. And one thing I've had quite good success at when I've done tabletops is I remember doing my first tabletop, and then when I was really early on, it was just one of those tasks they gave like the newbie person to do, like run a tabletop for us. And I'd not had much experience with the exec team, and oh boy, that was an experience. Very opinionated, and I guess that's why they do the jobs they do. I did learn from that instantly. So the next time I did a tabletop exercise, you could tell so you'd put a prompt and you say, okay, what we're going to do we pay the ransom, for example? And then everyone would look to the CEO and go, yeah, what's their response going to be? And then that would lead the conversation. And so you wouldn't understand actually what do people really think. So I started doing things like, I can't remember what the equivalent was when I started doing it, using things like Slido and Mentimeter to actually, the prompt would be, you vote on it, but you don't see who's voting. It'd be an anonymous voting. So it'd be like, is it a yes or a no answer? And you go, okay, like 7 people said yes. And so And what that was really good for was enabling people to have that psychological safety, because it was anonymous, to be able to actually say what they really think. And then it led to like, what is if we're all going to be in agreement here, it was almost like 12 Angry Men. Let's come to an agreement with the jury and work through this. And I thought that was really useful, to be able to build some psychological safety. And then it was just such a small tweak, had such great returns.
Massive impact. Impact again, isn't it, really? I used to love watching those things, because for me it was fascinating to not have to worry about the tech side of things, but you can see the different behaviours in the room, and you can see when things are starting to go off track and that sort of thing. It's utterly fabulous. And I think that if it's done in such a way that there's, even if you stop halfway through and have a think about where we are now, what's happened so far, are we happy with what we've done? It's not just dashing through it to get to the end of the exercise because we're trying to do it under pressure. It's about what are you learning from that. And the other thing that I learned with the military was, they call it after action review, debrief, call it whatever you like, but if you do a structured debrief along a timeline from start to finish, what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, what did we do well, what did we do badly, and you actually go and implement those in the next tabletop exercise, that's a beautiful way of learning. Absolutely beautiful. The worst thing you can do is do an after action review, have a report and leave it on your hard drive somewhere, never to be seen again.
I guess that if you're doing an after action review and then putting it and feeding it in, is that effectively a way of doing reflective learning?
Yes, it is. It's group reflective learning, if you like. And I actually did a piece of research, and I looked at what the British, the Canadian and the US armies did along these sort of lines, and it was really interesting. But some of them, at the time I did it, a dusty folder on a shelf somewhere. But what the real learning is to implement the learning from that. The triple loop learning is to go and look at the processes and put the processes right so the mistake can't happen again. So it's like lots of little loops of learning, if you like. So the first one is lessons identified. Second one is lessons learned, so you do something about them. And the third one is going back and thinking, actually, let's look a bit further back at the system and the processes. How did that occur in the first place? What can the organisation learn from that and implement to stop it happening again? But I think, generally speaking, after something like this, everybody's utterly exhausted and you don't even want to think about it. You just want to go home and go to sleep and be thankful it's all over.
And I think that's even the case for tabletop simulations. I felt spent after them. And I think that's a good thing, to actually, even though it's a simulation, to still have that adrenaline kick in.
Yeah, you've engaged with it. If you come out feeling shattered, you've engaged with it, so you will have learned something. And nobody says you have to do the debrief immediately. Sometimes it's helpful. Military do it, so they do what they call a hot wash. So they'll do a quick wash up afterwards, and then later on there'll be a proper debrief. But people come back, you've had something to eat, you've slept over the weekend, you've had a chance to let thoughts settle and think about it in a less emotional way, and you can see things in a different light. That could also be very, very handy as a learning tool. You don't do it when you're really tired. I mean, military have no choice because they're in the middle of nowhere doing things that don't necessarily stick to your average working week, but there's no reason why you can't go back, quick wash up at the time, and then go back and think about it when people have got the energy and the inclination.
Absolutely. I think there's been so much in this discussion that our listeners will be able to take away. I keep wanting to say readers. I don't know why I do. There is no transcript. Maybe one day when we can get a sponsorship, because those transcribing tools are really expensive. Thank you so much, Bec, for coming in and giving us your insights. You've definitely given me food for thought, and I'm very looking forward to when this episode airs to throw this at my team and say, this is how we're going to do tabletop simulations going forward.
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I always do enjoy these types of conversations because I think there's so much that I have to learn about cybersecurity, and there's so much that I have learned about psychology to pass on. I think, as we said right at the start, it's that sort of meeting of two subject matter experts and working together to facilitate each other's understanding, and that to me is just wonderful, and I think there's a lot of learning to be had from that. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Where can people find you? To tell us more where you can find about your business. I'm sure people will be clamouring to utilise your services.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I also have a website which is mindscienceltd.co.uk, and there's a little bit of information on there about this agile thinking that I bang on about quite a lot. So yeah, you can find me quite easily in either of those two places.
Wonderful. Bec does a lot of podcasts herself. I've seen YouTube videos. I'll put in the show notes anything that our listeners will find of use based around this topic as well in there.
Thank you.
As all your socials as well.
Yes, it's all on LinkedIn. I tend to put it on there because it keeps it all in one place. It's a bit hard to keep track of otherwise.